Chapter 42. Liberation Day 6. Bruno. The sun was setting. The amber light that bathed the city was nostalgic but filled him with sorrow. It summoned memories of his home and the wheat field flowing like an ocean of gold in a temperate breeze. His wives rested in the shadow of the mountainous mound as he slept. It was tranquil and with a pleasant scent. Not like this place with all the people rushing around without any destination. Cully was so small, but her weight did not match a person of her size. She had a power to make herself lighter, but he didn't like that. It was something to do when laying with someone like little Sato or Ojeran, but not when she came to his bed. The weight against him reminded him of holding one of his wives. Sexy time was possible with her, but they seldom did that. They were both in it for the cuddles. Falling asleep with her face buried in his fur soothed both of their souls. When she came to his bed in the late afternoon, he was sleeping deeply. She had lifted his arm and slid under it with her back to him. Her tails hadn't righted her this time. The brown ones were still fastened to her hip, and the black one was laying between her legs, hanging off the side of the bed. If he listened carefully sometimes, he could hear her softly singing to herself in her sleep. The words he understood were chilling, but it sounded so sweet. He just paid attention to the sound and ignored the meaning. He had to use the closest match for many terms in his language. Maybe it was the same for her song. There was no equivalence to the word date, and wife wasn't an apt description for his relation to the Olkesa in his herd. He had a nice arrangement with Cully and hoped she wouldn't be hurt when she found out about Haruka. After working with her at Nim for years, she'd finally responded to his overtures and invited him on one of these date things. He didn't fully understand what that meant to her, but she was willing to take the lead. There weren't many women large enough to make a good match for him. He understood her hesitancy. He was a herbivore. She was a carnivore. He didn't know what to expect. It was going to be interesting, and that was good enough for him. He kissed Cully between her shoulders before rolling out of bed. Her dark tail swayed as he walked away. Bruno got dressed and headed down to the kitchen. Haruka may want to see where he lived, which could be awkward if he didn't tell Cully about it first. He hoped she'd understand but wanted to make sure she had a full belly first. Cully preferred meat, which he didn't know how to cook properly. Bringing her a freshly picked wheat sheaf wouldn't be understood or appropriate. She wasn't mute. The gesture would be lost on her. When he arrived at the lobby, Jamie was at the front desk rearranging the work area. "I was told to ask you to take me clothes shopping," Jamie said. "Can you help me cook meat for Cully?" Bruno asked. "I'm not a chef, so don't expect anything fancy, but sure," they shrugged. "Good," Bruno smiled. "You make meat while I make fruity pancake. It sounds like breakfast. Do you have bacon and eggs?" Jamie asked. "Eggs, yes. From some ground lizard," Bruno said as he led them to the kitchen. "Bacon. I do not know what that is. It is not on the shopping list." "I'll see what I can come up with," Jamie reassured him. "Mind if I join you?" Jamie asked as they headed into the kitchen. "Not this time," Bruno said. "This is meal of acceptance. It is like apology before you do a thing. I will make extra pancakes for you if you want some." "Advance apology? What are you planning to do?" Jamie asked while rummaging through the refrigerator. "No bacon, but we have sausage." Bruno started cutting fruit as she warmed up the grill. "It is hard to explain. Cully is like head of our herd. I have been asked on date thing by women I work with. For my people this doesn't happen. Is one male, many Olkesa. Never woman in middle. This is new for me. I do not want to hurt or offend Cully. You understand?" Bruno struggled to find the right words. "If I've got this right," Jamie said, "you're worried about being kicked out of her harem?" Bruno tilted his head from side to side as he considered her phrasing. "I think yes." "She goes both ways," Jamie shrugged, "and it's just a date. Are you worried about her asking this other woman if she wants to join in, or asking if she can join in for that matter?" Bruno poured the fruit into a bowl of batter while considering the possibilities. "Hello," Jamie chuckled. "You kinda drifted off there." "Sorry," Bruno grunted. "Do you mind if I give you a little dating advice?" Jamie said as they laid out the sausages on the grill. "Please do," he said. "Put sex out of your mind. If it happens, it happens. If you go into it with expectations, you'll ruin it for everyone, Jamie said. Just try to be yourself and have fun. Bruno considered their words as they continued cooking. Before heading back upstairs, he told Jamie he'd take her shopping before leaving for his date. Cully flung her arm to the side as she rolled onto her back. She searched for him, but Bruno wasn't there. She pouted, sighed heavily, and slowly opened her eyes. The light stung her eyes. It had just reached that level where the beams of sunlight were blinding. She closed her eyes tightly, relying on her mistrionics to guide her through the room. She untied her tails and let her sarong fall to the floor. She made her way over to the dresser and groped through it for a skirt. She put it on with a little help from her twin tails. She was still wearing her fur bikini bra and didn't feel like changing into something else. Cully cracked her eyes as she navigated around a table to a comfy chair. As she sat down, she noticed there was an afterimage when she shut her eyes. Cully smirked. She hadn't refocused her eyes. He was still seeing the energy flow and the lights were on. The combination of that and the setting sun was intolerable. She refocused her eyes and cautiously opened them. As long as she wasn't looking directly into the sun, it wasn't that bad. She was startled by the skirt she'd dug out of the dresser. It was the mid-thigh length red and black pleated plaid skirt she'd bought on her first outing with Lilac. She'd purchased it as a way of sending a covert message to Tyrell and never expected to actually wear it. Honestly, it looked good on her, despite its resemblance to a skirt that had traumatized Kayla so long ago. It's her trauma, not mine, Cully snickered. The accompanying red knee socks that completed the look definitely weren't her, but the skirt was cute. Her tails swarmed around her, seeking nearby nautiloids. There was still one she couldn't connect with. It was at the heart of a cluster of shadowy not real. The former queen insisted that she gain the trust of the collective, and not merely bend them to her will. The not real were the oldest and strongest species, other than the weavers themselves, that she'd made contact with so far. The Cleator were the most numerous and obedient. They were the ones that had exterminated the Loctarians and subdued Kalmia. Somri's influence was greater than her own. Cully could only manage 3 weavers at any given time, 1 for each of her tails, but Somri had shared her power more freely. She was well on her way to forming a chain of command, with a being known as Louis and the baby weaver at the center of it all. Her stream of thought was interrupted by the sound of the elevator opening. It was Bruno pushing a cart loaded with food. "Now I'll have to forgive you for not being here when I woke up," Cully pouted playfully as he made it back to the room. "It is too early to forgive me," Bruno sounded frustrated. "What did you do?" Cully scolded. "Did you flirt with Jamie?" "No," Bruno scoffed. "They gave good advice. I have done nothing wrong yet." "Yet?" Cully cocked an eyebrow. "Eat first," he insisted. "It smells great, but I'm not sure I want to now." "You're not going to get in trouble for poisoning me, are you?" Cully giggled. "No," Bruno snorted as he lowered the plate onto the table and set out a place setting for each of them. "I take it you're waiting for my mouth to be full," she said as she cut into a stack of pancakes. "I was thinking belly," he admitted. "Finish. Then we talk." "Did you change your mind about running the hotel?" Cully asked in distress. "No," Bruno chuckled. "You remember woman who worked door at Nim? Her name is Hiruka." "The black-furred Maiko?" Cully asked. He nodded. "She has nice eyes." "What about her?" Cully said slyly. "She asked me to go to a date with her." He lowered his head in embarrassment. "A Mew and a Maiko," Cully mused. "It's like a minotaur and a dire wolf. If there isn't some old legend about a pair like that, there should be. Have fun." She continued eating in silence while he cycled through a rapid series of complex emotions. "Cully," he asked hesitantly. "Have fun. Is that all?" Cully shrugged and swallowed. "You're both size 2. I think it's a good fit. Maiko aren't common. And they're males do not. She can probably accommodate you better than I can. Then again, unlike me, she probably has a uterus, so watch the depth." He didn't respond but looked troubled. "If things go well, I expect to still get my fair share of cuddle time," she insisted. He smiled and the tension in the room dissolved. Jamie told me it would be bad to be thinking about sex during the date, Bruno said nervously. Many time I talked to her. This time Haruka asked me on date. I don't want to make mistakes. If Ojeran was here I would ask for his counsel. I have no idea what he'd say and I don't date, but if she said no that many times something must have changed. Any idea what? Cully asked. Other times she said she had a boyfriend but not this time, Bruno smiled. Dozens of potential scenarios rushed through her head, most ending poorly. You look upset, he observed. It may be nothing, Cully said calmly, but if you get in trouble don't be too proud to ask for my help. Bruno nodded slowly but she could feel his skepticism. Sometimes he was too forthright for his own good. All she could do was hope Haruka didn't tread on his heart. They quietly continued eating. Cully had her fill first. How was your trip to the toy box? Did you find what you were looking for? Bruno asked between bites. It wasn't completely fruitless. I want to buy a toy for my Tejmare to use on me so I went there to get a look at my options. I was hoping for a broader selection, but apparently penis is what penis does. It was mostly a matter of picking a size you are comfortable with. Including not size if you are looking at the canine models. Why those? Bruno asked. Well, Cully grumbled. The Cheshire models looked terrifyingly uncomfortable, and the authorized Curzon form molds were incredibly optimistic. Lunarian were out of the question. Females ruptured the male anatomy and that was horrifying. Bruno grunted. There really weren't that many species that were options unless I wanted a fantasy model that's more artistic than practical. If the Ferrocene design resembled their anatomy that would be one thing, but Ojeran was right. The thing was a mockery of their true endowment. Kimseti penile anatomy was remarkably close to Terran, Cully shrugged. The Shega types are short, stout cylinders that end with a flat top that goes off at a roughly 40-degree angle from the shaft. The Pashai designs were interesting with all those lumps that move up and down the shaft, but I was suspicious of the scale. I suspected they were like the Ferrocene's models and didn't adequately reflect reality. Bruno inquired. I'll have to tell you the Pashai story later, Cully blushed. Did you decide on anything? Bruno asked as he lowered his knife and fork. It's a big decision. I'd rather try out the real thing first, Cully grinned. I plan on doing a lot of experimentation to get the proportions right. Terran and canine types all bear little difference. If it has a knot, it's canine. If not, it's Terran. Did they have any Myco? Bruno asked hesitantly. Didn't I say you'll be a good fit for her? Cully grinned deviously. But your length might be an issue. Good, Bruno said. He sounded really pleased with himself. Down boy, Cully giggled. Nobody wants a charging bull. Bruno laughed. It was a deep, rich, jovial sound. I already know what look I prefer, but it's not something they sell there, Cully teased. And no, it's not yours. Bruno pretended to pout, then laughed even harder. He didn't need to know, but she preferred the look of Elysian genitals but not the frigidity. The shape complemented her physiology too, or would with a minor scale adjustment. Unfortunately, the Elysians were conspicuously absent from the Subterran selections. They did offer custom designs for the right price, she mused to herself. Using her Elysian friend as a base template for a custom model would be viable if she could make a few adjustments. Hopefully he'd agree to it during his next visit. By the time she left the toy box, she had 2 individual species and 1 category on her to-do list. Finding a male Shega she'd consider being intimate with would be challenging. The only challenge with regard to a caninoid was whittling down her selections and finding an individual who was willing to indulge her without it becoming a pack affair. That artist might be an option. Before leaving, she had explained her conundrum with the Elysian and asked if there was a better means of internal warming, which she immediately regretted. There really is a kink for everything, some of which she didn't want to know about. She purchased the cylindrical device that could help regulate her vaginal temperature before leaving. She decided to secretly stash it in the hotel somewhere where it was unlikely to be found. She really didn't want to explain why she purchased a device called Death's Embrace from a sex shop. It had better work as advertised. Tell me the Pashai story, he reminded her after he finally stopped laughing. Did you know they can see over 100 shades of black? Kali smiled weakly. No, Bruno said. Yeah, there's apparently a bullseye on my fur pointing right to my crotch. It attracted the attention of one while I was out yesterday. Kali blushed. It led to well, I checked them off my list. I may invite him by here sometime. He was really talented. But they're so small I'm longer than their entire body, he snickered. You're not that long, Kali smirked. Pa Shai are around 3 feet tall and his cock hung down to his knees. He said he was pretty average. So those molds were pretty accurate. In relative proportions, it would be like a Terran sporting a monster cock the size of yours. Sounds funny, Bruno said. I teased him about it. They're a half-size species with a size 1 penis, Kali smiled. He had a great sense of humor. He told me it's normal to him, and said, the first time he saw a naked Cayman guy he thought they lost the genetic lottery because there was almost nothing there. Bruno guffawed, then snorted to regain his composure. I'm glad I took the chance on him, Kali shrugged. He certainly felt interesting. The models were fairly accurate but the lumps didn't move as much. Some were more to the right, left, bottom or top of his shaft. He paused as the lumps passed into me one after the next, like a strange key being pushed into a far less intricate lock. It felt large for a being with such a small frame, but felt comparable to a Terran's in both length and girth. The tissue between the hard lumps felt silky and less rigid. It was nice but not what I'm looking for. He called himself Gojo and said he works in the sex tourism industry, so I hope he'll be a useful contact. Bruno seemed to be getting uncomfortable with discussing another man's penis, so she decided to end the conversation there. So will you have time to take Jamie shopping before your date? Kali asked. He nodded, grateful for the topic change. Is it late yet or is Sato still out? Kali smirked. I have not heard anything. They cleaned off the table and headed down to the lobby. Bruno headed out shopping with Jamie once they arrived downstairs. Once they were gone, Kali rushed to the ground floor security office to delete the footage of her hiding her purchase. If she understood the interface correctly, Bruno hadn't seen it before she had a chance to scrub the file. Her communicator beeped. It was a message from Bruno. He'd sent her a picture of Jamie wearing a light blue button-down shirt with a white collar and navy blue suit coat with a row of 3 pleats on each shoulder. It looked great on them. Kali replied, it looks great but it's missing something. Buy them a gold chain and pendant as an accent. He sent a message back to her warning that it was a designer brand worth over 500 credits. Kali laughed as she deleted her first response and told him to just buy it. Jamie wouldn't appreciate her joke about paying her back with sexual favors. It would look great whenever they felt like working the front desk. She heard a knock at the front door as she deleted the footage. She waited until the process completed before leaving the office to see who it was. The posh eye didn't know where she lived yet and Cho, Ojeran and Bruno could open it themselves. The only other people who knew where to find her were Dimitri, the Elysian refrigeration technician, and Trudy, Kali called merrily as she rushed to open the door. Trudy stepped inside and drew Kali into her embrace. Wait. I thought that conference wasn't until tomorrow, Kali said nervously. Yeah, about that. Actually, can we discuss this over drinks? Trudy asked. You have a fully stocked bar here, don't you? It would be a shame to let it go to waste. They sat together at a table with a full bottle and 2 glasses between them. They nursed their drinks as Trudy explained the situation. She'd come here to ask a favor. Kali doubted she'd be here asking if the situation wasn't so desperate. The hotel where the conference was scheduled to be held had cancelled their booking on short notice. They were claiming there had been some sort of clerical error, despite the event being held there every year since it was first established nearly a decade earlier. Being one of the shopkeepers who founded the Interbusiness Initiative, Trudy was taking this personally. She suspected it was retaliation for information she'd provided during Ojeran's investigation into the abduction of Sato Cho. Trudy suspected the Cayman Separatist Front was behind it. It was a revolutionary movement inspired by an author writing under the name of Javril Fates, which was embroiled in a struggle against a rival group called Terran First. Kali knew there were lots of players out there, each with their own agendas, but had never heard of either of these. Although, considering the number of Caymans and Lupians she'd killed on the 30th floor of Index Heights, She wasn't surprised to learn of Dr. Zayas' deep connection with Javril Thades and the Cayman Separatist Front. Kali agreed to let them hold the event at her hotel provided that the participants agreed to staff it during the event, and everyone walking through the door consented to a psionic scan which she'd be conducting. If there were people involved in either group planning to make an appearance, she'd like to meet them personally and dissuade them from targeting her friends in the future. While Trudy was drafting their agreement, she heard the door opening. Still no Strawberry. It was just Jamie and Bruno returning from their shopping trip. "I need to talk to you once Jamie goes upstairs," Kali said on a breeze that carried her words to Bruno's ear. "Out of curiosity, have you made any progress on that little project we discussed?" Trudy asked. "I found a Pashai to have sex with yesterday," Kali shrugged. "That just leaves Shaga and..." Trudy was just sitting there blinking in a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "Wait, which project?" Kali asked. "Using your psionic abilities to anticipate someone's wants and needs," Trudy teased mischievously. "Please tell me you didn't forget all your lessons already?" "Oh, that. I might want a refresher course," Kali blushed brightly, "but honestly I'm worried about people getting too attached." "Did I hear that right? You don't need it. You just want it?" Trudy asked in a playfully leading manner. "I'd have to check my schedule. I'm sure I can fit something in." Kali goaded. "Well, you are taking me on a date." "Well, if the evening goes well, who's to say what might happen?" Trudy needled with a lusty glimmer in her eyes. Kali shivered. "Watch that. You know I don't like it when people get too..." she started. "Oh, I know," Trudy interrupted with a coy smile. "But we both know what we can achieve together. You are one of my favorite students after all." "It's not fair to get me this worked up," Kali complained. "Who's being lusty now?" Trudy giggled. "What project did you think I was referring to?" "I'm going to buy a strap-on for my Tejmare to use on me." She thought it would be a good idea to try out all my options first. "Just need to pick someone who knots and a Shaga now." "Honey," Trudy grinned, "women don't pay a Shaga for use of their cock. It's all about that tongue. It's as flexible and versatile as one of your tails. A bit thicker though on average." "That's a relief," Kali sighed. "I'm really not attracted to Shigas." "You were considering laying with a man you're not attracted to just get a feel of his penis," Trudy chuckled. "Are you sure you wouldn't consider a career in sex work?" "Still no," Kali smirked. Bruno waved to them as he strode into the room. "Oh, hello again," Trudy smiled. "You never did thank me properly for my help. Come here. You offered to show me the final challenge of the Will It Fit event at NIM." He unzipped his pants while approaching the table. "Bruno," Kali sighed. "You just can't keep that thing contained, can you?" "Oh, you poor thing," Trudy said. "That's terrible. With a tool that large, I'm sure you've never learned how to efficiently use it, have you? I know someone that specializes in technique training for the overly endowed. If you're interested, I can introduce you to them." Her words shattered his prideful look. "It works," he insisted. "So does a battering ram," Trudy said scornfully. "Don't you want to be more than that?" Kali cleared her throat and started explaining the conference venue change to him. When he left to go on his date a half-hour later, he seemed troubled. Trudy's words had unintentionally cut him deeper than any knife. "Do you have a reliable uplink here?" Trudy asked. "It was secured by cyberpaths," Kali said. "But don't worry. It wasn't him. Some Kaylani investigators stopped by my shop to ask me about that incident." Trudy smiled warmly. "They assured me he'd be dealt with." Trudy used the hotel uplink to put out word to the attendees to let them know that they were back on for tomorrow and needed everybody's cooperation. Kali heard someone staggering through the front door an hour after sunset. She couldn't feel their mind. It must be Cho, but it sure didn't sound like her. She was usually so graceful, having spent years developing a waitress reflexes. She sounded either drunk or hurt. Kali got up from the table and rushed toward the lobby. "Is something wrong?" Trudy called after her. Kali stopped dead in her tracks as she saw Cho. Cho was wearing a deep back neck and a dual high-slit dress that was stain-covered and torn. It was one of the dresses Ojeran had bought her. Her arms and legs were lined with bruises. There were scratch marks on her hips, and her hair and face glistened with a thick coating of tacky whitish fluid. Kali's first instinct to find the people and kill them was countered by the big goofy grin on Cho's face. "Hi, I'm home," Cho giggled. "Was all that consensual?" Kali asked in dismay. Cho nodded. Trudy walked into the lobby, took one look at Cho and said, "Impressive glaze you've got there. Go get yourself cleaned up," Kali smirked. "You stink." The elevator door opened for Cho as she staggered over to it. "You might want to burn that dress," Kali yelled as the door closed. "She'll be feeling that for a couple days," Trudy chuckled. "There goes my mood," Kali grumbled. "I'll remember you said that when I hear more about your strap-on research," Trudy chided. "You'll have to try out a lot of dicks to get the sizing right. Your friend looked like she was the centerpiece of an orgy. Don't be too hard on her for getting all hers at once instead of spending months trying to answer a single question. Don't forget, different people have different tastes." Kali didn't have a response to that. She wasn't willing to admit Trudy had a point. "I've got a lot of work to do if we're hoping to keep this on schedule and limited time to do it." With any luck, she'd make contacts at the conference that could help with the hotel's objective. "All the shops above the 5th block will be shut down for a full local day, which means most of the lower shops will be real busy tomorrow," Trudy said. "Oh yeah, that reminds me," Trudy added as she stepped behind the counter and jotted down a note. "Something that may help with your project," Trudy said, then folded the piece of paper and headed for the door. Kali contacted Jamie to let them know she would need them to work the desk the next few Galactic Standard days. Kali unfolded and looked at the note. "Window dressing?" Kayla snickered. "Wasn't that the club that Jax wanted me to go to so he could point a camera up my skirt?" The club management weren't at fault for his behavior. Kali trusted Trudy's judgment, and from the note's content, it sounded like she knew the owner personally. Then again, she knew a lot of people. She ran a small shop in the upper blocks and was always willing to help the community. It was both beneficial for them to know her and to be known by her, and Kali felt that was worthy of admiration. It was a 5th block establishment, which meant they had their own security. "Well, it won't hurt to look into it," Kali muttered to herself. On a whim, she bound her tails together before heading out for a walk. She'd check the shops for something too, where that would make her look less conspicuous. She made a deal with herself that she'd only check out window dressing if she found an acceptable way to conceal her unique pigmentation. As much as she liked her physiology, it made clothes shopping a real hassle. Terran outfits didn't accommodate her tails. Cannonoid clothing was the closest fit, but was designed for someone with thick body fur. She'd never tried felinoid attire, but the fur problem remained. It protected them from colder. The A-room live in the desert. They're short-haired, Kali scolded herself. "One of my friends is in A-room. Why hasn't this occurred to me before? That dress Nelfrey wore out to that club on Hyrule was gorgeous." She opened up her comm interface and looked online for an A-room specialty store. She was in luck. Traditional A-room clothing, being desert dwellers, was airier than Cayman wear. Instead of slots to slide their tails through, their tails hung loosely behind their legs. All she had to do was get the sizing right. She purchased a half-dozen new dresses before returning to the hotel, including a replacement for the indigo split-panel dress she had bought to wear on her date with Trudy. She sent a message asking if Strawberry wanted it as a replacement for the one she ruined earlier. Cho was quick to accept. Kali got so wrapped up in her shopping trip she'd forgotten about the club. On her walk to Flesh Row, she noted an advertisement for a new item at the corner boutique. She stopped to take a look at the corset displayed in the right window before heading inside. Both of their sales personnel glanced at the door as a jingling tone signaled her arrival. "I saw your ad for the custom fit masks. Where do you get them from?" Kali said. "I'm sorry, but I'm not at liberty to say. It's a new product. I do hope you understand," the saleswoman said apologetically. "I'm not wearing mine, but I'm pretty sure it was a prototype." She said she can't say, the male on duty insisted. "Please respect that." Kali was convinced Kiryu had designed them. "May I examine the stitching on the cowl?" Kali asked. "Yes ma'am, of course," the saleswoman said cordially as she led her to the display and proceeded to explain the fitting process. She seemed offended by Kali's disinterest in listening to her sales pitch. The stitchwork was proof enough of its origin. It had been made at Alliance Arms. "So are you looking to purchase?" the saleswoman began. "I already own the prototype," Kali smiled, "but I am interested in the woman's corset in the window display." The woman looked questioningly at her male counterpart. "It's the black satin bondage hook and eye without boning," he said. "Is it under bust? Or the bustier top?" she asked while walking to the front. "Over bust," he answered. The customer who ordered it defaulted on their payments. "It is very expensive," the saleswoman cautioned. "We can only give you a 20% discount if you purchase the display model. We do offer financing and many sizing options for." "It looks like it should fit. I'll buy it. Just show me how to put it on." "I'll wear it out," Kali interrupted. "I'll get her rung up," the salesman said while walking to the register. "For future reference, we usually only see customers with an appointment, but things have been a bit crazy today." "I'd imagine it would be with that hotel debacle," Kali smiled. "But Trudy and I were able to sort everything out. She just wanted something that looked nice and would cover the stripes on her chest and back. It was waist length and would serve her purposes nicely. It cost just over a gal cred. They threw in the accompanying collar for free as thanks for allowing them all to make use of her hotel." The Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Epsilon, Zeta, Eta, Theta. These were the 8 planets of the echelon system. This naming convention was adopted by Ishilur long ago to circumvent samsar and pronunciation issues. The capital Alpha had been closed to visitors for hundreds of years. This had led to a strained relationship with the High Court, who no longer consider them an allied nation. The most recent outbreak of the samsar and plague devastated an estimated 90% of the indigenous population. The Ishilur released the plague from time to time to cull the samsaran population, but it had never gone out of control before. They had never been this reckless. Something was different beyond the numbers. The echelon masqueraded as samsaran gods. Whenever one died, they disguised the truth by claiming to have ascended or reincarnated. Announcements of these events tended to coincide with the release of the plague, but not this time. The plague consumed their worlds one after the next. Believing they were being punished by their gods, the population accepted their fate. The E2 had piled the bodies in the streets to be burned like cordwood. In the midst of all this, the only pronouncement by the government was of the birth of 3 new gods with suspiciously samsar and sounding names. Intercepting that shipment of arm rigs to make it look like the wearer had additional arms was a good start, but they needed more than that to prove to the samsaran people that their gods were dead. Belladonna had risked war with the Kailani Dominion in an attempt to best Akia. The local government undoubtedly would have known better if the Ishilur were still in control. She needed that ship and the bodies of its crew, alive or not, as proof of the unprovoked attack on another nation, but each time the local forces or her own tried to approach, they were consumed by some force that lurked in the shadows of the wreckage. She had no choice but to retreat at dusk on Echelon Delta and resume her efforts at dawn. Whatever this force was, it only attacked people within the darkness. She did all she could to secure their encampment for the night. There were only a half-dozen High Court-approved leech hatcheries spread across Corrales. House Orwell was more influential than her own. Belladonna would continue having the upper hand, as long as the Orwells were able to block her from acquiring a replacement. Asking Oleander to intervene with that branch of his family was pointless. He sired children on behalf of House Adam, not the Orwell line. She tried to connect with the old uplink transmitter in the nearby Black Church-controlled Rondev system. She needed a new leech and needed to circumvent conventional means of acquisition. She left a message in a dead man's chest drop box for her childhood friend Yamandi Serral. Last she'd heard, her friend was on the run, so there was no way to contact her directly. With any luck, she still checked for messages once a week. House Serral fell from grace thousands of years ago, but they were still able to get their hands on leeches, and Akia intended to find out how. Before disconnecting, she sent a quick message to Oleander, mentioning Yarrow's rumor, asking him to give her best wishes to the new Somri, and requesting that he warn her to stay clear of the echelon system. Death wasn't reason enough for Belladonna to stop holding a grudge. His response message was quick and terse. After sealing away her sexuality behind a barrier of fear, you should worry more about yourself. Regardless of its content, his reply gave her closure. The Sam she'd once known was no more. Only her body remained. Syntholo. The wreckage spanned a quarter-mile. As burned and broken as it was, he could still recognize the ship. Of all the ships that could have crashed, why did it have to be this one? It was the same vessel that had carried Lady Darkseid and himself to Erosha. It was the Jump Fleet yacht Adamancy. It was a lightly armed and armored diplomatic vessel, not a warship. It had been swatted to the ground as if a great hand had reached through the stars to strike it down. Smoke rose from its hull and sparks flickered throughout the intact segments. Shadows flickered and churned around it in patterns that didn't match the intermittent displays of light. He'd seen shadows like this before on board the Kirame array. He knew these weren't mere shadows but were alive in strange ways he could not fully understand. They traveled with Clotharia, and that was enough warning to keep his distance. But there were other signs of life within and near the wreckage. The intermittent light of an escape pod that had failed to properly launch flashed beneath the twisted mass. He could see someone moving around in there just beyond the shadow's reach. Syntholo's shape shifted, taking advantage of his dark fur and ability to cloak himself in shadow, to keep himself hidden from prying eyes. He crept along a wooded cliffside watching as people approached the wreck from 3 separate vectors. The first was clearly local security forces traveling in an orderly formation with crisp, clean uniforms. The second, the closest of the 3, looked like scavengers from a nearby village, and a third looked like well-armed mercenaries. With his dark force abilities, he could step from shadow to shadow without treading upon the expanse between, but his range was limited, and the creatures far below would feel him moving among them. He could manipulate normal shadows and even assume his own shadowy form, but lacked experience fighting in their two-dimensional reality. The shadows he cast could be disrupted by normal light, but theirs persisted. Light bent by psionics, generated by technological devices, or conjured by mystrionics didn't have any effect on them. From his time at the array, he knew his ability to manipulate shadows could slow or divert them individually, but not hurt, harm, or contain them. The searing light abilities from lore might be effective, but that knack was extremely rare. The E2 had a better likelihood of awakening to it through mystrium exposure. Even then, it was only around 1% of the population and they had never had proper training. Then again, that was years ago. He had no idea what their current knack distribution was. The shadows made short work of the Samsar and security forces, wiping them out completely. The mercenaries withdrew to regroup quickly after their initial attempt. The group he assumed to be scavengers, based on their gear and attire, were the most cautious of the 3. They took advantage of the chaos to grab what they could before pulling back. While the mercenary troop planned their next move, he watched as the riffraff ran forward until the shadows began to move, at which point another member of the group would yell for them to pull back. The subterran language of their calls was familiar and distinctive. They were E2. They must be from the group that had been covertly trained by people loyal to Lady Darkseid before being sent here. He sat studying them. While watching their dangerous game, it became clear that there were only 2 shadow entities. He'd seen this hunting style before. They made arches closer and closer to the wreckage one after the next. One spotter paired off with each runner. Once they reached the end of the group, they switch roles and start over, mapping the entity's territorial boundaries with each step. This was a technique used by the E2 Pathfinder tribe to mark out hunting grounds and other hazards. The E2 pulled back to the tree line as the mercenaries made another run at the ship, this time armed with lasers. Syntholo watched at a safe distance as they learned the error of their ways. They lost another third of their number before their weapons proved ineffective. A full-spectrum spotlight would have been more useful. Their objective abruptly shifted from looking for survivors to trying to get rid of the evidence. Luckily, the shadow entity had thwarted most of their efforts to set demolition charges. The E2 didn't return to continue their exploration. Instead, they continued deeper into the woods as the sun began to set. The mercenaries were erecting a force field fence. If he didn't do something now, there would be nothing left in the crater by the time the sun returned. He couldn't do this alone. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to make contact with the E2. He traveled from shadow to shadow while moving further into the woods. He continued toward the E2's path of retreat until coming to a small break in the undergrowth, emerged from the darkness which concealed him, and searched for a straight branch with a blunted tip. He held it against a tree, scraped it against the bark twice and slapped the side once. He waited to hear a reply. He heard the faint trill of a bird call, followed by the scraping of bark. He bent the branch until it started to splinter, growled, then smacked it against the side of the tree twice. A different bird call filtered through the trees. Syntholo thought he knew all the signals their hunters used, but that didn't sound quite right. It might have been an actual bird. He heard a string of explosions and raised voices. It sounded like the mercenaries were making their next attempt. He rushed back through the woods to the ridge overlooking the crash site. He could see the glow of the field emitters, but there weren't many people currently at their encampment. They must have been studying the E2 during the delay between their first and second attempts. Several of them were making a commotion in an attempt to draw the attention of the shadow entities while others rushed in to set more charges. Kayla had called them darklings. They were not simple shadow entities. They were fiendishly intelligent with an in-depth understanding of advanced technologies. He had to rescue the crash survivors while avoiding the notice of the darklings, the mercenaries and their leader, who seemed far too comfortable reclining within the ring of field emitters. He could tell they were Lamentic from the glow of soul stones visible from yards away. She was the real threat. The darklings would let him run from them. Most Lamentics could typically use two separate knacks reliably as long as they had soul stones. And they could reflect or redirect a third one. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a Lamentic opponent. Her stones were green, blue and red? That could be a problem. The one he'd faced before was just blue and green. Could this one use 3 different knacks? He knew they had an innate ability to cancel out some knack abilities used against them, which would limit what abilities would be useful in combat if they came to blows. Fortunately, the electrical abilities he inherited from the 3-tailed shade fox he bonded with should be unaffected. He rested his hands on his twin Yatagon swords, slowed his respiration and slipped into a combat trance. His black blades rasped as their glimmering edges slid from his scabbards. The darkness around him shifted as yellow lighting flickered through the cloud of inky black miasma which flowed from each of his 3 tails. A crackling sound reverberated around him, mapping his surroundings. He leapt into one shadow and out of another as his dance began. As he passed through the shadows, he could feel them churning with a life of their own. A spray of blood cast its own shadow as his blade slid through one of the mercenaries before he twirled away into the darkness. He felt it again. Those must be the darklings. He redirected the flow of his dance. The ground shook and the shadows shifted. Electricity arched as one of his swords found its mark, and another redirected gunfire as he returned to the 2-dimensional world. This was a martial art he'd developed for his own use. The mercenaries had no counter and seemed unable to differentiate between him and the darklings until he was ready to strike. A black plume, a flash of light, the bite of steel, the chill of death, and then he was gone. He felt the Lamentic trying to find him between each stroke, but each time her psyche slid off his mind. Her attempts to influence him were thwarted by his cerebral implant. He and the darklings felt her team one after the next. He focused his efforts on the people seeking to misdirect the darklings while one of them sabotaged the explosives. The other he was unable to find. They may be attempting to reach the survivors, but thwarting them would mean stopping his dancing blades. In that moment he'd be vulnerable to attack by everyone present. His fur was scorched as he whirled back into the shadows without his blade making its mark. There was flame but no concussive wave. The Lamentic had gotten close that time, but shadows don't continue to burn. She was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Another string of explosions caused the shadows to shift, changing the location of his exit point. Reality warped around him momentarily. He tried pulling the shadows to him, but felt the resistance of the darklings pulling in 2 different locations. As his dance slowed, he caught a glimpse of a many-armed something shimmering in the blackness. It appeared to be formed from mist, with numerous glowing violet eyes, and a sinister toothy grin that grew and contracted as it flowed simultaneously like smoke and water. Was this how the Darkling had looked through Jake's multifaceted eyes? He had the feeling it was watching him despite its numerous eyes. He eased his grasp of the shadows and spun toward the other, which was stationary, feasting on a glowing blue. Was that a soul stone? He struggled against their will as he tried to pull himself free from their reality, which he once thought was two-dimensional. Clearly it consisted of far more that laid beyond his normal ability to perceive. Even now his brain struggled to process his surroundings. Was his soul in danger of being consumed like that stone? He activated soul touch, hoping they'd recognize the feel of their queen who he'd touched before. In that instant he was cast from their reality as if being vomited from the bowels of some great and ancient beast. Syntholo caught his footing and swung wildly in an attempt to maintain the flow of his movements. His first blade hit its mark before he had the opportunity to judge his surroundings. Vines sprung up, grabbing at his second sword, entangling it and yanking it from his hand. A sphere of flame exploded just behind him. The elite combat weave robes absorbed some of the damage, but the flames ignited his tails. The Lamentic woman was right in front of him, the Darkling feasting just to his side. He drew his pistol from its speed holster as his sword swung upward. She sidestepped the pistol barrel while deflecting his blade with a metallic rod. The vines continued to grow, pulling on his leg and grabbing at the deflected sword. He questioned the wisdom of reverting to his shadowy form this close to a Darkling. She swung at him with the metal rod, connecting solidly with the side of his head. One of her red soul stones flared. She must have failed to activate some ability. He leveled his pistol and fired again. He tried to dodge but not far enough. The bullet tore the side of her face, her white clothing reddening further from arterial blood. The blue soul stone the Darkling was feasting on dimmed noticeably. The disfigured woman staggered back. Syntholo took advantage of the moment to wrench one of his swords and his leg free from the brambles. Lamentics don't kill Lamentics, a woman's voice cackled from somewhere behind her. Should I tell him where your leech is before you siphon its life force, or let him figure it out himself? Bitch, the injured Lamentic roared as she spun to face the other woman, instinctively evading his sword thrust as she did. From his angle, it looked like her injured face was starting to mend itself. I remember you, the second woman said. Her voice sounded familiar, but he just couldn't place. Bella keeps her leech right there. Her finger flickered momentarily. As she extended her finger, 2 arrows flew from the tree line, one firing wildly, the other sticking into the badly injured woman's abdomen. She went limp as Syntholo's blade slid through her body. You're Syntholo, right? The second Lamentic woman said. I'm Akia. We first met back on Gelit a few decades ago now. I'm working with the E2 this time. I'm guessing you finally perfected that fighting style you were developing. We seem to be working on the same team now. Feels nice, doesn't it? Come join us back at camp and we'll get you all patched up. We can deal with this once the sun comes back up. Dusk may be pretty, but it's a bit too unfriendly. There are 2 survivors. I need to save them, Syntholo insisted. You may want to take a pair of these with you as a distraction, Akia said while gathering belladonnas and used soul stones, leaving the one being consumed. It's your life, but join us back at camp for a few minutes. Just let us mend your wounds so you can make the most of it, Ah urged. Grudgingly he agreed.